Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. We're talking all things climate. And in this segment of the show, I've brought in Andrea Leon-Grossman from Azul, and she's going to be talking about desalinization. How are you, Andrea?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you are welcome. And we're going to start by continuing with Steve Horn. And we're going to talk about Jerry Brown. And anytime you feel you want to pipe in, because you're very knowledgeable about all these subjects, Andrea used to be an organizer with Food and Water Watch, feel free to share your comments. So we who have been living in the state of California have been watching Newsom go back and forth when it comes to fracking. First, he comes on the scene and articles come out that say he greenlights 103% more more fracking wells than even Jerry Big Oil Brown. And then when this comes out, he's very embarrassed. He puts a 6-month moratorium on it. Then in the height of this global COVID-19 pandemic, he secretly starts fracking again, greenlighting these permits with a vengeance. So, Steve, tell us what Newsom has been doing with fracking. And then we want to discuss a related bill, SB 345, which is this key strategy that we fractivists have been using over the past couple of years. Instead of having a moratorium on fracking, what we're doing is asking for 2,500-foot setbacks from a school, a home, or a business, because this will affect all oil drilling. It's not just fracking that's done in California, it's cyclic steam injection, it's acidization, even routine well maintenance can cause adverse health problems for people living around these wells. So I want to talk about what he's been doing with fracking, also how this bill, SB 345, has been watered down. Now, our friend Sherry Lear from 350 South Bay doesn't agree with you on this, but I want you to share why you think it's almost meaningless now. Let's go to you first, Steve.
We'll start with 345, and then, yeah, I'll start with 345 since I just said that. So AB 345, because it's fundamental understanding everything else, that was last year's big effort by so many environmental justice groups in California to create this 2,500-foot setback, as you said. And procedurally, what happened is the appropriations chair of the Assembly, Lorena Gonzalez, who's a representative here in the South Bay of San Diego, turned it into a 2-year bill, which means that it goes on to 2020. But what happened in between, well, that was a way of stalling it, and that's what I talked about a little bit with you in the first segment. A lot of this was the byproduct of the efforts of the Common Ground Alliance, the alliance that has been created between labor and the oil industry, which was spearheaded by the Western States Petroleum Association, the WISPA, and Chevron and other companies. So through those efforts, they solved the bill, turned it into a 2-year bill. But that is not all that happened. And that's where I think a lot of people get lost in the story. They think, oh, this lives on through 2020. We're fighting for the same thing. Well, they're not fighting for the same thing anymore, because in between 2019 and 2020, the bill was also amended. And now, instead of saying by 2020 there will be a setback, it is saying by 2022 we will consider, by the 2022 deadline, consider a 2,500-foot setback. So the language has changed. The word consider has been put in there, and it gives leeway for it to be 2,500 feet. It could be 500 feet. It could be 300 feet. Or it could be 2.5 feet. It could be 0 feet. It could just be that the status quo remains. They say that at the end of it, there has to be some kind of setback, so it probably won't be 0 feet. But it does not mean that it will be the scientifically recommended 2,500 feet by any means. And so I think that's where I don't know if there's an argument between me and her. I don't know if she has seen the amended language. I don't think a lot of people realize that the bill is not the same bill anymore in terms of what the original one was and what the language of it is. And that's significant because that goes into, of course, this lobbying effort helped, I don't want to say watered down the bill. They could still fight really hard have an amazing grassroots battle, and in the end of it, it's still 2,500 feet. But they still bought themselves an additional 2 years of drilling, and that could mean hundreds, if not thousands, of new drilling permits. It's already meant that. They've already issued in 2020 thousands of permits. So by 2022, it'll be thousands more. And that gets to the second part, which is, while those permits happen, as part of this whole negotiation over AB 345, while that was happening, there was a corruption scandal over fracking and over investments in fracking that some of the people at DOGR, the Division of Oil and Gas Resources in California, they had investments in Exxon and other companies, which was revealed by I forgot what paper it was, but a major California paper. And at the end of it, Newsom comes out, fires the head of DOGR, Ken Harris, and puts a moratorium on fracking. It lasts for 6 months. They do a study, and I guess as the end result, and they literally say this is the end result of their study, what they learned from their study is that we can do more fracking. So he issued, I believe it was, by the end of it now it's 48. I forgot how many the original was, but now between April and June, 48 new fracking permits. Most of them through a company named Aera Energy, AERA, which is a joint venture between Exxon and Shell. And then most recently, 12 more, or a dozen more fracking permits to Chevron. So talking about the biggest of big oil are now getting fracking permits, all in the same area. Lost Hills oil field, which is the sixth biggest field in California, which is, and as I've been writing, 97% Latinx community. And as he's out there speaking about Black Lives Matter and racial justice, he's issuing fracking permits and drilling permits that are impacting people just of a different race that he's just not talking about it when he's issuing those permits. And in the stories I've done, they kind of say, oh yeah, they pay some lip service to it. They say we have this whole, basically they go back to this process that's been created, these public hearings over AB 345 and the consideration of the setback. They're falling back on that to kind of show that they care about environmental justice. So this public hearings process, basically this stalled out process, they're pointing to that as, it's kind of come full circle. They're actually pointing to that as their feat for environmental justice, even though while they're doing that, they're issuing hundreds and thousands of more permits. So that's kind of that's the reality of what's happening right now in a place like Kern County. There's so many more permits, predominantly Latino poor community. So Newsom can talk a good game about racial justice, but as people have told me within that community who I've interviewed, it's like this is definitely like a casebook study of environmental racism that's happening within these communities that have this oil drilling.
Yeah, and what's sad is I think so many people are preoccupied by the pandemic. Their personal concerns about how I'm going to, make income, how I'm going to pay my rent, am I going to be homeless next month? And even the activists are all focusing on, Black Lives Matter and police brutality and this incredible moment that we're in, that it seems like they're using this to sneak in all these horrible things. And even in the city of Los Angeles, they're talking about only 500-foot setbacks, and they're ready to start approving that. What would you like to add to this topic of increased fracking permits and AB 345 and environmental justice here, Andrea?
Yeah, and Andrea, I want you to talk about the connecting dots between the lobbyists. I didn't mention them, but if you want to talk about those fellows who are close with Newsom who are working on your issue, I think that's important as well.
Yeah, I mean, talking about environmental justice, I've seen with Poseidon that they just have an army of lobbyists. And that's something that they have in common with the oil industry. And I mean, when you talk about people of color, they cannot even afford one lobbyist. And I mean, who's going to speak for our interests and for our health? And that's when we don't have a level playing field. And especially now with the pandemic and this economic crisis, it's really been hard to have really public engagement with the gutting of the Brown Act. I mean, many people in communities of color are now either essential workers or they have a huge digital divide. And when you have all these public meetings on Zoom, I mean, how are you expecting people to just leave everything behind and engage in a 4 or even a 12-hour proceeding like we had with the Regional Water Board on May 15th. And the same thing is happening with oil and gas proceedings. So it's really concerning what we're having. And whether it's City Hall or LA City Planning with the new plans for homes. And again, everything connects in terms of climate change, in terms of environmental racism. And we need to make sure that people don't get more disenfranchised, especially as we speak about Black Lives Matter. How do we bring people into the fold and have a seat at the table? The same thing with the human right to water. It's not something that we just, put a frame on the wall saying, oh yeah, this looks nice and it's a nice thing to say. It's like, how do we put it into practice and make sure that water is clean and affordable for everyone, not just for a few people? So I think that's critical, and right now is not happening.
Yeah, I want to follow on Andrea's point just because it reminded me of it's not just even the Latinx community that's being disproportionately impacted by this drilling. If you look downstream, you look at where this stuff gets piped, it gets piped to refineries, so it's piped to, you could say, like, well, in the South Los Angeles area, it would be still disproportionate. But next, if you look at the Richmond area, that's a mix of the Black community, it's a mix of the Asian American community, that's a mix of the Latinx community. So but the point still stands that this is environmental racism. While he's talking a great game about Black Lives Matter, actually why I brought him up was because when he issued the permits in Lost Hills, the June 1st ones, that was on the same day as he gave a big address on racism. That was sort of right as the protests and the eruption happened around the movement for Black Lives. So literally on that same day, he issues the permit. And I think that is important, but it's also important because I think that going back to like what Andrea is working on with desalinization and water issues, what I was referring to is it's the same exact lobbyists who helped make this happen. If you look at, that was my story that I did in Capitol in Maine. I forgot the other lobbyist name, but one of them, Kevin Schmidt, is Newsom's, when he was lieutenant governor, his senior policy advisor. He's now a lobbyist for Era Energy. And he was lobbying for this alongside the other guy. I forgot his name, but I do remember the important fact. He was the head of Newsom's transition team when he became governor, also just a longtime Newsom aide. And his wife is actually Newsom's wife's stylist. So this is like a close personal friend. These same lobbyists are the ones who are lobbying for the thing that Andrea and her coalition are fighting against for the firm Axiom Advisors. So they lobby for all kinds of pretty atrocious things, but among them are for several oil companies, including the one I mentioned, Era Energy, and for Poseidon. So those issues literally share the same lobbyists in common.
Well, why don't we talk about Poseidon now? We'll skip ahead to that because we've referenced it and I don't think the people understand what it is. Talk about the history of this Poseidon desalinization plant and tell people who don't understand why desalinization isn't such a great idea. Everybody's saying we need water, this is our last opportunity, we're going to desalinate. Why it's not only is it expensive, energy intensive, and also environmentally unsound.
Well, like you said, I mean, people are like, yeah, we need water. Why don't we just, we have the Pacific Ocean right here. Let's just get the water from there. And countries like Israel have done it successfully. But the first thing they did was efficiency. And that's the one thing that we haven't done. And I think desalination should always be considered as the last resort. And we're just not there yet. Poseidon has been looking to build this desalination plant since 2000. And the reason they want to build it in Huntington Beach is not because it's the best geographical area to do it or, the best location. It's just that that's where the most conservative leaning in terms of politics are. So we really need to make sure that people understand that. They also have a gas power plant. These desalination plants use a boatload of energy. They use the same amount of energy as 35,000 homes day in and day out. So they really need a source of energy that can power that much energy. They kill a lot of marine life at the intake. And then once they've done desalinating water, they can only do half of what they intake. Then they have this thick brine with chemicals that they dump back into the ocean, killing even more marine life. The plant they already built in Carlsbad has had all kinds of issues. They have been cited many times because they dump more brine that they have been allowed to do. In April, they actually had to shut down for 2 weeks because of the red tide. They claim that this is the only climate-proof source of water, and that proved them wrong. It's really interesting because during those 2 weeks that they had to shut down, they had to pony up $15 million to the water district in San Diego. That just came out today in an article. So this is really the most expensive, the most energy intensive source of water that we can get. Now this plant in Huntington Beach is just not needed. They have enough groundwater to go by, and the water that they get from up north is about 10 to 20% of what they have, and it's much cheaper than what they would get from Poseidon. So we're talking about water rates going up. For renters, that means that the rent can go up if the owner of the building will pass those costs on to the renters. And again, it's just something that goes against the human right to water, and it goes against people of color, because those are going to be the ones who are going to be most affected. They have already cut their water use to the bone. They cannot cut even further than what they have already cut. And we have a study from UCLA pointing to that. And they even have a study from the Metropolitan Water District in Orange County saying that this is the most riskiest water that we can get. It has been really hard to, again, have public comment with this pandemic, especially from people who are going to be affected by this project. And then we have found out that, for instance, Kathleen Brown, who's Jerry Brown's sister and a board member from Sempra Energy, is one of their attorneys. And there's a lot of synergy between Sempra and Brookfield, who is the parent company of Poseidon, a Canadian company. So there's again, a lot of stuff that is happening. They have an army of lobbyists pushing for this. And it's, again, not fair. It goes to the systemic racism that we're experiencing. Because again, people of color and people who live inland are going to be paying a lot of money, just can't afford even one lobbyist to say, and, you know, hey, can you influence our vote? Or, you know, can you do this for us? They have spent millions of dollars in lobbying and campaign contributions. So again, it's just an uphill battle, but we're here to fight the good fight. And the hearing is going to be for the permit from the Regional Water Board on Thursday and Friday.
Now that's this week. Why don't you explain to people who have not ever made public comment from a Zoom meeting before how that works? Because it is not difficult. And I think most of the people running these meetings have it down to a science. And there is a way that you can do other things while you can multitask while you're waiting to make your public comment. I know because I've done it. So why don't you give people the instructions, and then also you can put it into the comments of the show.
Yes, I actually put it already on your invitation today for this wonderful show, and I'll put it again. But basically, you just sign up to give public comment, and they'll send you a confirmation on the Zoom, and you can log in and just kind of have it on the background while you're, you know, preparing dinner or doing your errands. They'll give you 2 minutes, and basically, again, there's a lot of data out there about why this desalination plant is just not right, not needed, and it'll cost a lot of money. It'll cost marine life, just what we need to protect the ocean the most. So again, I'll put that link for you to join these hearings, these proceedings. After this vote for the Regional Water Board, it will go to the Coastal Commission. Where, again, we just don't know if we have the votes or not. It's also very likely to be challenged by CEQA. A lot of the emissions are they claim that this is going to be carbon neutral because they're going to buy offsets out of the state in terms of biogas and biomass. And some of them are going to go to Ecuador to buy forestry credits. So a lot of these is basically, you know, pay to poison credits. They get to pollute here, they buy credits elsewhere, and a lot of people get screwed.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Do you mind if I do, Lauren? It's about
No,
the
because I thought this was a good segue into your thing about cap and trade, but go ahead.
Oh, well, it's a good segue. Yeah, we can talk about that too, but I'll start with Andrea, just it's related to that. So is the offsets, is that part of, you mentioned that it would be in the global south, I forget what country you mentioned, but is that part of the tropical forest standard? Is that then, because I know that was authorized last year by the Air Resources Board. Is that something that they're citing, or is this something?
It was really hard to find because the only document that Poseidon had put out there, it's a couple years old, and it's part of their carbon emissions program. So the forest credits that they're buying are from Ecuador.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'll just say for those who are watching, last year the California Air Resources Board passed something that could make schemes like that more possible than they ever were before, because the Air Resources Board voted to, as part of the California Cap and Trade Program, make it global through tropical forest standards. So to use forestry around the world in the name of deforestation to basically permit other polluting projects like the one that Andrea had mentioned. And it could be, maybe it could be oil, maybe it could be sprawl real estate projects, could be a whole host of things. But California Air Resources Board voted to kind of globalize the already problematic cap and trade program. So yeah, that, Lauren, if you wanted to ask something about that, but I thought that kind of piqued my interest when you mentioned the global extension of it.
Yeah, well, this is, you know, Fran Pavley, and you might remember, both of you, I fought her SB4, which is her bill, to mostly it was to have a study on fracking. And after 2 years, the study recommended more studies, as they often do. Didn't really have any regulations on fracking, but everybody said that, oh, you know, we have to support it because it's Fran Pavley. And if I heard this phrase once, I heard it 100 times. She's the best friend environmentalists have in Sacramento. And her major thing was the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was passed in 2006, which set up this cap and trade program that Mary Nichols runs. And basically, it's one of those market-based mechanisms like a carbon tax that actually does nothing except enrich the markets. So like Chevron can pollute up there in Richmond or in Torrance as long as they buy some rainforest down in South America. But then what they end up doing is displacing those people off the land. And they who have been, the indigenous peoples who have been living harmoniously off the land, hunting and gathering, fishing, whatever, are thrust out into the economy where they can't make ends meet and they become poor, they become alcoholic or whatever. And therefore, the indigenous peoples are very, very much against these market-based mechanisms. So you just did some research about, and this ties in because Andrea and I also fight SB 50. Which is Scott Wiener's bill. I mean, you were talking positively before, Steve, about how we need density because transportation.
I agree, SB 50. What I was kind of referring to, the SB 50 model is extremely problematic. It's, yeah, like, I know that you both agree, but yeah, mostly a Trojan horse for gentrifying developers for sure. I thought they all pay lip service to equity and stuff, but yeah, the details absolutely matter for how it plays out, and SB 50 is a perfect example of a charge.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into that whole thing because Andrea and I can go for an hour about these YIMBYs who are like, yes, in my backyard, but then it really comes out it's not in their backyard because somehow it's banned in Marin County. But you wrote an article about sprawl in San Diego and cap and trade and how a judge did not approve that project. And I wondered if you could talk about that. And also, hold on, I'm scrolling down to my notes. So again, I think you made mention of the fact that not only is it not as effective as actual regulations like banning fracking, but it ends up not always being economically profitable. And we can see that now during the COVID-19 pandemic. So can you get into a little bit about that story?
Yeah, that's a pretty, I'll answer your question about the case, and then it kind of got me thinking about the cap and trade program itself. And the judge ruled that the San Diego County, what would be the general plan, which deals with all kinds of things, but includes housing. Within that general plan for housing, they're trying to offset sprawl development and allow it within the general plan if they can offset it elsewhere through cap and trade. And the judge ruled that it was just so egregious and so out of line with CEQA and for what could be shown and documented under CEQA that it had to be thrown out. And this is a general plan that's been challenged multiple times in the past decade. And it was supposed to be for this current decade. We actually don't even have a current general. We're still going by the old general plan because this one is still being litigated. So yeah, I would say that those in the environmental community thought it was a pretty big win because, and probably was because it prevents a fast track from sprawl development from happening. And our Board of Supervisors is currently 4-1, so 4 Republicans, 1 Democrat. It could change a lot in November. It could very likely switch from 1 to 4 to 3 to 2 Democrats, depending on, certainly there's one seat that's very highly contested, and that will determine the balance. So this was probably a last chance really for sprawl developers to get this kind of, potentially a last chance to get this kind of scheme, and the court ruled it down. But what the court also ruled is it doesn't apply, you can't see this as a precedent. So just because it applies to this case, it doesn't apply to other things. It doesn't apply to the statewide program. It's not analogous in other cases, very strictly applied to the San Diego County general plan. So that got me thinking about what's happening right now with the cap and trade program in California. It shows the whole, let's say, the ridiculousness of cap and trade as a program. It actually, the financing of it, and I forgot the name of the program, but there's an environmental justice component of it that funds EJ programs. The financing of that is entirely reliant upon pollution. So if you don't have pollution happening, you don't have funding. That funding doesn't go to this program for the communities, and therefore these programs run dry. And that's what's happening right now in California because emissions are down due to COVID, the economic situation that exists, the fact that people aren't driving as much, that's the #1 emitter in California. All of these factors are leading to less emissions, which are leading to less money into the cap and trade program, which in turn are leading to potentially complete reconsideration of the cap and trade program. And I think that it's being talked about at those levels. I'm not sure if EJ groups are thinking about it in that way. I'm not sure if the climate community, I think people are so busy thinking about other things right now, maybe they don't realize it, but at the top levels of those who administer the cap and trade program, at the Air and Resources Board, for example, in the Newsom administration, they're really thinking long and hard about like this. I don't even know if they're thinking about it from an environmental justice perspective, but they're definitely thinking about maybe it's showing some of the irony of the program itself is that it's reliant on this pollution, and all of a sudden we have less pollution. Like this pandemic was more effective at cutting pollution than the cap and trade program was. That should say something about the effectiveness of cap and trade as a policy level. Hopefully they're learning some lessons from it, but it's definitely popping up in different news accounts and in discussions. So,
and it's also really bad to become dependent on these revenues. You know, people always criticize California for not saying we're the only state that doesn't have an oil severance tax. And look at Alaska, every citizen gets a, you know, like a universal basic income pretty much from that oil severance tax. But they don't think what that means. That basically means that people become dependent on this continued practice that is killing humanity, you know? So Food and Water Watch, as you remember, Andrea, was like the only environmental organization that really took a stand against this cap and trade. Them and the Indigenous Peoples Environmental Network, I think they're called.
Yeah.
And they, had a big manifesto that they released in the last COP about that, which I always share with people, progressives who seem to think, oh, we need an oil severance tax in California, but we really don't. Anyway, we've been going a really long time, so I just want to finish up with two subjects, Steve. And one of them, you referenced Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. She has a whole chapter in there about geoengineering. Like, she calls it technological fixes. Like, are we going to be able to get out of climate change by seeding the clouds and whatnot? You've been doing some research into two proposals coming out of the Newsom administration. One, apparently, he's backed away from, the solar one, regarding geoengineering. Can you talk briefly about those?
Yeah, well, they in name they backed away from it. I think they backed away because they got caught a little bit. It was supposed to be kind of surreptitious. It was supposed to be through this backdoor relationship that they had with Harvard, in which the head of the Strategic Growth Council, Louise Bedsworth, she until last week was the chair of something called SCOPEX, which is to explore solar geoengineering with some of the leading scientists around geoengineering, including David Keith, who people can look up David Keith's name with geoengineering. That's who California was partnering with without saying they were. They said that she was doing it in a voluntary capacity, and this was all on her own. So I did an open records request, and some of this work was being done by other groups. So I don't want to say I'm the one who came up with the idea of like looking into the program. It had been done months before I got involved, but I did an open records request last week. The results came back. They responded to me and said, well, there's emails indicating that she certainly was using her work email to do this. And that was that was not what she should have been doing. And so I learned that on that same day, she had resigned from this Harvard partnership as the chair. And she did not say, I resign as participating in it. It was just as the chair. So that's significant, but it does show, I think, that they realize there's people watching, and they realize that these kind of things like solar geoengineering, or the other one they're pushing called direct air capture, these are going to anger environmental justice advocates. When you have something like direct air capture, which Chevron is pushing, which Bill Gates is pushing, which Exxon is pushing, Occidental, when you have geoengineering things that are funded by the oil and gas industry, it raises questions about what's the purpose of them. And it goes right back to the very same thing we've been talking about, cap and trade, going back to the carbon capture and sequestration for the national push. These are things that keep the fossil fuel industry in business and doing business as usual, while they get to say we're also providing the solutions, or we will be part of the solution. So what's happening in California with direct air capture, Mary Nichols endorsed it at a February hearing. What's happening with solar geoengineering and the kind of the shady way that they're handling it shows that at the highest levels in California, and going back to AB 345, going back to fracking, which we've been talking about, it shows they're doing what they can to keep the oil industry in business and to keep business as usual happening, while they, on the one side, and then the other side, while they say, we are a global climate leader and we are the ones to model ourselves after. Lo and behold, at the national level, now we now see the Democratic Party in their platform and the things that they're pushing are modeling themselves after California. And that might not be a very good thing, or as I like to say, as goes California, ... That's the whole phrase. We're seeing where it's leading, and it's not necessarily always a pretty picture.
Yeah. Well, I got one more question, but I just have to interject to say that your reporting is so fantastic. I mean, I would say that you and Sammy Roth from the LA Times are doing some of the deepest investigative work into these connections, following the money, following the lobbyists, following what the regulatory agencies are doing, following what Newsom is doing. Oops, we lost him. Oh, nope, now you're back. So I want to let people know, and you can post this in the comments too, how they can support your work at the Real News Network. And also, Andrea, your work with Azul, because I haven't seen anybody writing about this desalinization plant, and it's so crucial that we stop this. And I am fretting the fact that so much of this is happening under the table right now, you know, because you said the Brown Act. I mean, the California legislature still hasn't figured out a way to meet yet. It's pretty outrageous, actually. I think they were going back to work, and then all of a sudden they got a couple of COVID cases, and they used that as an excuse to scrap their plans to go back to in-person sessions. But, you know, it's really hard during this pandemic when they're not having public meetings to follow this stuff, you know? You really have to be very diligent sitting on these really long, endless Zoom calls. And I'm keeping up with a lot of issues. My friends who are fighting for single payer, my friends who are fighting for racial justice, you know, and a lot of the things that we predicted at the beginning of this pandemic have happened, whether it's the farm workers who have come down with COVID-19 or the people in the jails who have come down with COVID-19. I remember back in March, you know, doing protests about this, and we warned them and they didn't do anything. And it's really a racial justice issue. And that leads me to my final question, Steve, which is your recent reporting on how the state of Arizona is using firefighters to fight fires, even more prisoners, prison labor to fight fires. And there's more prisoners doing it than actually paid firefighters. And we know how much firefighters make, so we can see why they're trying to do this. And they do this in California, but the situation isn't as egregious as it is in Arizona. And it really is a racial justice issue. So just for the final topic that we're going to discuss, can you please tell the viewers what's going on there with that?
So in Arizona, as you said, there are far more, as I learned from looking at the budget and then asking how many people are actually prison firefighters. It stood out to me that in their budget, they only had 88 full-time employee firefighters that work for their Department of Forestry and Fire Management, or the DFFM. Stood out to me because it didn't, for a state that big that has massive wildfires, didn't seem like a lot of people. So, and then I saw in a press release, they had historic wildfires in June. I already saw that there were 113 prison firefighters who had responded just to those fires. So I realized that's already more than the 88 that are full-time employed if you look at the budget. I came to learn that 113 is only 2/3 of what exists. So it's 193 prison firefighters to 88 full-time employee ones. And if you look at the wage difference, if you took a whole year's salary, the prison firefighters they make $1 to $1.50 per hour. They would make, if they worked a 50-hour week, which is standard in the industry, they would make $4,000 a year. If you took a full-time employee of the Arizona DFFM, I think it's close to 50,000. So they're making over 10 times the amount, even though there's over 3 times as many prison firefighters. And they openly told me within the DFFM that they're using it to save them money. I was surprised that she told me that. She said, yeah, certainly we have budget shortcomings, and we use it to save money. But if you actually look closely at the budget, just while we're kind of in this moment of talking about police budgets and when we're talking about prison budgets, the prison budget for the Department of Corrections, if you look at juvenile and adult, it's close to 1.2 billion compared to, it is 9 million for the DFFM, the Department of Forestry and Fire Management. So it's like astronomically more money is spent on locking people up in these prisons than on paying for even the salaries of the full-time employed people within the DFFM, or hiring more people. And then the same thing, if you look at the state troopers, I forgot the exact amount, but it's in the hundreds of millions. It's like close to 300 million or something, where, so that even at their state level, their state law enforcement is getting so much more budget money. So it's not really that they have budget shortcomings, that they're spending so much more on policing and spending so much more on their prisons, and then using that very same prison labor to fight these wildfires. And it just came into kind of the limelight because Arizona had 3 of its top 10 biggest wildfires all happen at the same time back in June. So sort of this moment that we're talking about where everyone's attention was on what was going on in the streets with Black Lives Matter, Arizona was having, not only were they having an uptick in COVID cases, that was why they were actually in the news, probably mostly, and Trump going there for his speech in the midst of all that got in the news. But at the very same time, that's when the wildfires were happening. And at that very same time, to bring it full circle, most of those, over 2/3 of those who are employed within the DFFM are prisoners. So it's 31% to the rest is prisoners. Yeah, it's definitely, it's more disproportionate to California, but it doesn't let California off the hook by any means. California has its own issues with it. And there's still plenty of firefighters who are prisoners in California. Actually, I'm working on a story about the deeper history of that. I'll just preview it a little bit. The deeper history of the prison camps for firefighters in California, to kind of put a fine point on it, has its roots in the state's genocidal history with its indigenous population and the missions that all of us know about who live in California. Those famous missions were California's first mass incarceration system. So that'll be an article that should come out in the next couple of days to kind of what we're doing at the Real News.
Well, you know, what's interesting about that is I know in California, they really want that job. The prisoners really want that job, not so much because they get paid, but because they get outside.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what's so sad about it, that they want to get outside to do this risky work because it beats being inside the prison. But the really tragic thing about it is then they also think they're going to be able to get jobs as firefighters when they come out, but there's all sorts of obstacles put in their way. And you wrote about that too in your story.
A little bit, yeah. I wrote about a little bit in the Arizona case, and I'll say that in the California case, I spelled that out pretty well. And just for those who are interested in California politics, there's a hearing about some of this stuff on Friday within the Senate Public Safety Committee in front of Nancy Skinner, who's the chair of the committee, on that kind of issue with expungement for those who have criminal records and who've served in the program. So there's a bill, I've got the bill number, but that bill is going to be heard on Friday, at least if that still holds up. There's going to be some kind of committee hearing about it, and that's a big thing within those who are the criminal justice community and people who see the intersections between climate justice and our criminal justice system. I think they should be looking at that as well, because these are the interesting ways that climate does interact directly with something like the criminal justice system and prisons.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both. We've got to leave it at that. We've been going for an hour and a half, Steve, and 45 minutes with you, Andrea. So thank you so much for being on the show. And I want to tell viewers to please share this show. If you don't feel like sharing an hour and a half show, I will be uploading this to 2 separate programs on my YouTube channel, and I will be posting those links on my page. But as you can see, my show is for the patient. I'm not going to be doing these really short 15-minute clips. We really need to delve into this stuff. And if you really want to make a difference, you have to understand it. You have to get into the weeds. And I appreciate that people don't really have the time to do that. But for those that do have the time and that do have the interest, I want to thank you for sticking through this program. And I'm working on trying to get Michael Leidy or somebody from the platform committee to talk about the debacle that is Medicare for All. I've already reached out to the woman that's leading that petition, and she says she cannot speak to me until after the convention. But, you know, the pledge, 600 delegates who have already signed, including some Biden delegates, by the way, that they won't vote for this platform because it doesn't have Medicare for All in it. And, you know, if you're just watching my show for the first time, I'm still continuing to do it here when I'm out of state. Last week I had Savannah Kinzer on, who was the Whole Foods worker who was fired for wearing and distributing Black Lives Matter masks. And as soon as she was fired, she and 13 other employees did a class action lawsuit against Whole Foods. So I'm doing some great shows this summer, if I do say so myself. And I really hope that you all keep watching, keep sharing, and keep fighting. And thanks you guys for being on tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just stopped the live stream, and now I'm going to stop the recording. All right. So that was good. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. That was fun. Yeah.
You
Thanks
gotta
for having
wonder
us.
how many people like stick the whole thing out, you know? It's just like really in the weeds. I mean, maybe.
Have you considered ever considered putting your show on podcast as well?
I have considered it, and I've been told how to do it. There's like some service where as long as you're okay with ads, you can upload your audio just one time, and then it gets it out to all the different major things. So it's just a matter of having to sit down and do it, you know? And I also
I would.
noticed between the first and the second show, I lost my virtual background, which was the sunset in Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, I
noticed
noticed that too.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know what happened. I think once I stopped the recording, I lost it. But anyway, it's hard, you know, I'm doing this thing with just myself. When I think back to my public access days in the 80s, it was literally it would take 9 people to do a show like this. You needed 3 cameramen, a floor manager, a director, a switcher, an audio operator, a lighting director, a graphics operator. And here I am doing this thing with myself and my computer. It's just quite amazing when you think about it, you know?
Totally, yeah.
So anyway, all right. Well, I hope you get people, Andrea, and please, you know, share the show. And like I said, I'm gonna and as soon as I'm done with this, I'm gonna wait for, you know, Zoom to send me the recording. Then I've got to upload it. I've got to download it to the computer. Well, I guess it does download to the computer, and then I've got to upload it to my YouTube, and that takes forever. And once I upload it, I can tweet it out. So hopefully I'll be able to tweet this out tomorrow, because it's already late here, and I don't know that I'm going to do it tonight.
Okay.
Good to
But
me, yeah.
obviously I'll tag you, and feel free to put in your, you know, Twitter handles and your information where people can follow you in the comments.
Will do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, guys.
Good night.